Back in September of 2017, my girlfriend and I of 3 years ended up going through an extremely bitter breakup, and since we were living together, I boxed up my stuff and moved out on October 1st. I stayed in a hotel for almost 2 weeks, and working by day and then searching for apartments by night, but most of the places I saw advertised online were, in a word, depressing. My initial searches excluded all shared apartments because I did not like the idea of having some random roommate. But as time went by and my hotel bills started creeping towards 4 figures, I started dropping more and more of my search filters. I started to seriously consider the possibility of having a roommate, especially if I could meet them prior to moving in, so I could kind of assess if they were going to be a problem or not. Everyone I talked to on the phone seemed either sketchy, unreliable, or a combination of the two. But then, right when I'm about to give up, I met Florian. Florian was seeking a roommate to help pay the rent on his 2-bedroom apartment in Bushwick, and when I clicked on the photos of his place, I was shocked. The apartment was really, really nice, kind of like a rustic warehouse type of vibe, but all the fittings and furniture looked brand new. But the best thing was what Florian wrote in his little About Me section. He'd written something like, "I work exclusively at night, so you have the apartment to yourself in the evenings, but I require complete silence during daylight hours." I just started working from home at the time, and complete silence in the day was exactly what I was looking for. I sent him a message, we spoke on the phone, and then I arranged to stop by the apartment to talk face to face. The place was even nicer in person, and in many ways, Florian seemed like the ideal roommate. He was tall, this skinny Estonian guy, very dry and reserved, and wore a dark turtleneck and glasses. He said he was a filmmaker and was undertaking a project that exclusively involved night shoots, hence why he'd be out of the apartment by sundown. He was a sober vegetarian, but didn't mind if I kept meat or alcohol in the apartment. In fact, he didn't seem to care what I did, so long as I didn't smoke or make any noise whatsoever during the daytime. After explaining my situation and why silence during the day was ideal, I decided to test out his sense of humor and ask if he was a vampire. He didn't laugh. He didn't even crack a smile. He just replied, "No. As I said, I'm a vegetarian." And thankfully, my attempt at humor didn't spoil my chances, and since I volunteered my share of 3 months' rent in advance, he offered me the room right there and then. The following Monday, I was moving my stuff into the apartment. I had to wait until after 7 p.m., but with the help of a very flexible moving company, I had everything moved in by 11, and by the end of the next day, I was unpacked and settled in. Living with Florian was like living with a ghost. He kept his end of the staying silent deal by being a ninja whenever I was asleep, and since sometimes I go to the gym or go grocery shopping around the time he left for work, we'd sometimes go days at a time without seeing each other. I had a quiet place to work during the day and had someone who wouldn't infringe on his schedule or lifestyle while paying half the rent. It was ideal, really. But sometimes Florian was so quiet it was almost spooky. I'd wake up, head downstairs to make my coffee, and walk into a spotless kitchen. But then when I opened up the fridge, there'd be a week's worth of vegetarian meal prep all boxed up and ready to go, when the previous night there had been nothing but a few beers and my leftover box of halal cart street meats. I know that might sound like a weird thing to complain about, but I'm not even really complaining about it. I guess what I'm trying to say is that was the closest thing to a red flag I ever got with Florian, and I kind of wish there had been more to go on. And so, for the first 7 to 8 weeks, I lived in a state of almost complete bliss. I'd somehow managed a clean break from my ex-girlfriend, so although it still bothered me somewhat, it wasn't like she was blowing up my phone, and she certainly didn't know where to find me. And then having my brand new, uber-quiet, super Gucci workspace with its minimalist decor and monochrome color scheme made it very easy to pour myself into my projects, find my peace, and just sort of move on. I'd found the perfect temporary living arrangement, or at least I thought I had. One day, I finished work at around 5, walked down the block to get some noodles from the good old Cantonese place. Then, when I was walking back to the apartment, I felt my cell phone buzzing in my pocket. It was Florian. and when I answered the call, he asked me in his typically dry tone for a favor. The location that they had in mind for that night's shoot was, in his words, unavailable, and to avoid having to reschedule the entire shoot, Florian wanted to know if he could use the apartment. He was very apologetic, promised it to be a one-time only thing, but told me that I'd have either to vacate my apartment for the evening or remain in my bedroom for the duration of the shoot. I told him it was no problem, especially if it was just a one-time deal, then told him that I'd meet him back at the apartment. About an hour later, Florian arrives with his two friends, one guy and one girl, and they have a bunch of what appeared to be equipment bags with them. The girl was small and attractive, and the guy was a little bit overweight and balding, and despite being American, both shared Florian's sort of art hipster vibe and were just as quiet and reserved as he was. Once they were ready to set up, I grabbed my laptop and stuff and then started walking up to my room. The apartment had a small second floor when Florian asked if we could talk in private. I invited him into my room, asked him what he wanted to talk about, and for the first time since I'd known him, Florian had some semblance of emotion on his face. Florian looked unusually concerned as he explained how some might consider his project to be, quote, unusual. It required complete immersion on the part of the cast and crew, which was why under no circumstance was I to leave my bedroom during the shoot. And this was around 8 p.m., and I was due to sleep at around 11, so I had no problem retiring to my room to play some Civ or just watch Netflix until I dozed off. Now, Florian said that that was good because the shoot was going on until about 1 o'clock in the morning. Obviously, I wasn't all that excited at the prospect of having my sleep disturbed, but that led Florian to ask if I had a good pair of earplugs or some headphones that I could use to drown out the noise. But then that got me thinking, what kind of noise was he talking about? I half-jokingly asked if he was making an adult movie down there, and in his typically dry fashion, he said no, that was not the kind of movie he was making. And my curiosity was pretty truly piqued at this point, so I asked him what kind of noises I could expect to hear, and in response, Florian told me something I'll never forget. He told me, "You might hear some things that might frighten or disturb you, but I can assure you no matter what you hear, it is merely a simulation, and there's no reason for you to be alarmed." I asked Florian if he was making some kind of horror movie, and he said no. It wasn't a horror movie as such, but it did contain elements which some people might associate with horror films. Apparently, this is why it was so important that I wear headphones or earplugs, otherwise I might not be able to sleep. I told him as long as there wasn't any screaming, we'd be fine, and that's when Florian asked again if I wouldn't be happier just vacating the apartment until 1 a.m. Honestly, I was way too tired to head out to some bar and force myself to stay awake until 1, and since I had a good pair of noise-canceling headphones that I could use, I figured I'd just brave the noise and, at worst, stay up until the small hours watching movies extra loud until the shoot finally finished. And the plan worked perfectly for a while, and for the first hour or so, I didn't even have to switch on the noise-canceling setting on my headset. I actually had it switched to ambient aware because by that point I was honestly so curious as to what kind of noises Florian was worried about me hearing. I figured there'd be yelling, probably some screaming after Florian's soft admission, and I just severely underestimated the kind of screams I'd be hearing, as well as the effect they'd have on me. Now, I'd been playing Civ 5 for about an hour and change before I started to hear the first noises coming from downstairs. It was the sound of a woman sobbing, like these drawn-out sounds. And since Florian had already told me that she was an actress, the sound only made me uncomfortable, not frightened or disturbed. And I switched my headphones to noise canceling and turned up the background music on my game and found the combination instantly drowned out the sobbing noises. I think that lasted for maybe 20 to 30 minutes until eventually I started to hear another kind of sound. One so loud it started to cut through the noise-canceling feature on my headphones. I reached up to the speaker covering my right ear, lifted it up, and then instantaneously recoiled when I heard the sound that I'd been shielded from. The girl downstairs, actress or not, was letting out the single most blood-curdling scream I've ever heard. I could hear the exact moment she ran out of breath as the scream kind of weakened and died, and then she started up again right after with yet another ear-splitting screech. She did this over and over, and at one point I clearly heard someone yelling louder at her, but I couldn't tell if it was Florian or his friend. I knew it wasn't for real. I knew it was just an act, but there was something about that lady's scream that set my teeth on edge. I could only sit there listening to it for a minute or two before I secured my headphones over my ears and just pumped up the volume on my laptop even further and tried my best to forget it was even happening. I tried my best to just focus on playing this game, but I could still hear those nails-on-a-chalkboard-style screams, and they might have been very faint, but I could still hear them if I focused my attention on them over the music coming from my headphones. The only way to completely drown them out by then was to boost up my volume in my headphones to like 100, but that got so loud that it started to actually hurt my ears, so it wasn't sustainable for more than a few minutes before I had to lower the volume again. Thankfully, the screams had petered out altogether by the time it came to lowering my headphone volume, and I got to spend the next few minutes in relative peace before I suddenly started to hear the sound of frantic begging creeping through the music in my ears. Once again, I lifted my headphones, and once again, I heard some skin-crawlingly convincing acting from the lady downstairs. Only this time, she wasn't screaming. She was begging through tears and shallow breaths. She kept saying, "No, please, no. Please, God, no," and other variations on that theme, and she did it non-stop for about 14 straight minutes. I guess talking loudly was easier on her vocal cords than balls-to-the-wall screaming, but that allowed her to do it unceasingly for way longer than she screamed for. Again, I was thankful that I was able to just drown it out without deafening myself with the music from the game that I was playing, but somehow, all the begging got to me even worse than the screams did. And I swear to God, even with Florian's warning that the whole thing was just acting, every fiber of my being wanted to make her stop. I guess it bothered me in this sort of deep, lizard brain kind of way. Something passed down from our ancestors that means when you hear someone begging for their life or screaming in agony, it's impossible to just sit there and ignore it. And that's why, even when I couldn't hear the girl begging and sobbing anymore, I could still sort of feel it, you know? The screams came and went for another few hours, then around 10:30, I decided to take a shower and to try and get some sleep. Both upstairs bedrooms were fitted with attached bathrooms, another perk of living there, so I got to drown out the noises with a podcast and running water while I got clean. But then, once I got out of the shower, there was a brief window where I had to get my hair dry before putting my headphones back on, and in that time, I heard the most disturbing thing yet. I was still listening to my podcast, and I'd picked probably the loudest person possible to listen to, shout out to Tim Dillon, but as I was drying my hair, I started to hear what sounded like all three people chanting downstairs. I was kind of curious as to what they were chanting, so I walked over to my phone and lowered the volume on my podcast and heard, "Hail Satan, hail Satan, hail Satan," getting louder and louder. Well, they sure must have been talented actors because they were giving it everything they had, wailing those two words again and again like they were in total ecstasy. I ended up lying on my bed, headphones on, blasting myself with some YouTube playlist called Relaxing Ambient Music that ended up being neither relaxing nor ambient. And when 1 a.m. rolled around and everything finally went quiet, I literally whispered, "Thank you, Jesus," out loud to myself before finally drifting off. And the next morning, I felt kind of groggy after getting less than 6 hours sleep, but as my brain booted up in the shower, I remembered all the screaming and chanting from the night before. I couldn't really be mad at Florian because he'd warned me a whole 2 times to vacate the apartment, and besides, there were much worse things than him owing me a favor. As I mentioned earlier, Florian and I rarely bumped into each other, so it was days before I got a chance to ask him about the screaming. And when I did, he gave me about as dry an answer as you can imagine. He apologized profusely for the disturbance, both literally and figuratively, but was also quick to remind me of the warning I'd been given. He said the screams and the chanting for what he called ADR, or Automated Dialogue Replacement, which is basically when you dub audio over a movie to make it sound better. No one was being threatened, imitated, or hurt in any way, and the lady in question was just a very talented actress. If the sound she made disturbed me, then it simply meant that she'd put in a good performance and nothing more. This was obviously quite reassuring, I guess, but my main objective was to get a second assurance that it wouldn't happen again, and if it absolutely had to, then to give me advanced warning so I could book a hotel or something. And he agreed, and I thanked him, and that was that. Now, not even 2 weeks went by before Florian asked me for a second favor. I had a feeling it'd be related to using the apartment for his work, and lo and behold, I was right. He opened his pitch by telling me that he was more than happy to pay for a night in a hotel, but that after a studio had pulled out on him, he'd been left with nowhere to shoot. I told him it wasn't necessary for him to pay for a room, that I could maybe find a place to stay, and even if I didn't, I was perfectly happy to pay for my own hotel room. Florian then gave me the date of his shoot, which was a couple of days away on a Friday evening. I happened to have been dating at the time, and it was just around the stage where it'd be acceptable for me to propose a kind of sleepover, if you will. And I proposed as such, and she accepted, so I had that Friday evening covered. I had no reason whatsoever to return to my apartment until, of course, I realized that I'd forgotten part of my laptop charger, the plug part that connects to the little box thing, and there'd be no starve-together LAN party unless I returned to the apartment to grab it. I briefly considered proposing a movie date instead, but the girl I was dating had seemed super excited to play, so I thought, screw it, and then caught the train back. I figured it'd be an hour at most, and that once I got back, we could get down to our LAN date. Plus, I called Florian in advance and gave him prior notice that I needed to stop the shooting for all of 30 seconds maximum, then be off the hook for any interruptions. I texted Florian as I was walking to the subway, then, when he didn't reply, I gave him a call once I was back in Bushwick. He didn't pick up on the first call, so I tried again, only for that one to ring out, too. And I figured that he was busy and his phone was set to Do Not Disturb or whatever, so I texted him a second time saying that I was minutes away from the apartment and would only be interrupting him for like a minute max. Again, I got no reply, and I was kind of worried that my intrusion might cause some kind of issue between me and him. And at the same time, I was thinking, I pay my rent, I'm a good roommate, I can be in and out in 30 seconds with a few apologies, and then if Florian's mad, well, I can just deal with that issue as and when it comes. A few seconds later, I'm at my apartment building, walking to the elevator, then a minute more, I was at my door. Since I don't want to disturb too much, I start knocking on the door. I had my key ready, but just like with the texts and calls, I wanted to give Florian as much advance notice as possible. I knocked once, got no answer, then tried calling Florian one last time. He sent that one straight to voicemail, so I knew that he knew that I was trying to get in touch with him. And that's when I started to get a little annoyed. At least work with me, don't just ignore my calls. I get that he was busy, but he literally could have just grabbed my laptop cable, opened up the door, and given it to me, and hey presto, he's back to his shoot. But he didn't. He actively ignored me. So after a minute of waiting for a call or text, I took up my key and opened up my apartment's front door. The first thing I noticed upon closing the door behind me was that someone had taped a bunch of clear plastic sheeting all over the place. They were on all the floors, on the walls, and there were strips hanging between open doorways like they were supposed to be flimsy replacements. And I'm thinking, what the hell? And then I started calling out for Florian. The second I called out, I started hearing heavy footsteps coming towards the apartment's entrance hallway. They were walking with urgency, so right away I'm thinking, uh-oh. And I'm halfway to unleashing a string of apologies when 2 masked men stepped into view. They looked like nightclub security or something. Black suits, black shoes, black shirts, and black ties, all very well fitted. And the only difference was, these guys had these matte black masks on, real thick plastic by the looks of things, and the moment they saw me, they started power walking in my direction. And I'm like, wait, who the hell are you guys? But they didn't say anything. They lunged towards me, gripped me up, and then the next thing I know, they're slamming me down onto the floor so hard it knocked the wind out of me. I'm lying there for a moment trying to catch my breath, then when the fight comes back to me, I'm trying my best to buck them off, and I'm failing miserably. The whole time I'm yelling at the two guys, "Who at the F are you doing? Get the hell off me." But again, they just completely ignore me and start yelling, "Intruder." I'm like, I'm not an intruder. I live here. And right then, I hear the crackle of a stun gun before I feel this intense pain shooting up my leg, and suddenly, I can't move or talk anymore. I tried to carry on fighting when I realized that I could move again, but I was so frazzled from the stun gun that I felt like it had drained my battery or something. There was nothing left in my tank, and all I could do was just lie there while those two heavies had me pinned, and wait until I had another opportunity to escape. I was still yelling for them to get off of me when someone down in the apartment's open sitting area, who I couldn't see, asked in a very authoritative voice tone what was going on. I immediately went quiet. Then one of the two masked men repeated the same word, "Intruder." And the person who spoke, whose voice I didn't recognize, then told them, quote, "Remove me." The two heavies immediately dragged me into the hallway outside the apartment, dumped me on the ground, then went back inside and closed the door behind them. I was like, what the hell just happened? And then after I picked myself up, my first instinct was to call the cops. Something was going on in my apartment, and whatever it was, it didn't seem like any kind of movie set or whatever. And the first thought was that it was some kind of home invasion, but then what was with all the clear plastic sheeting? They reminded me of something from Forensic Files or Hostel, or the kind the Mexican cartels use in those kill houses, so the walls and floors aren't soaked with blood. That's what freaked me out so much that when I called the cops, I wasn't like, I'm pissed and those guys are going to pay. It was more like something terrible is happening up there in my apartment and it's down to me to stop it. Yeah, I was angry at those two masked men for body slamming me and tasing me, but it wasn't like they were two crackheads who broke my nose after stealing my laptop. Another true story. The way those guys were dressed, the masks, all the plastic sheeting, they were security for something that was going on in there, something no one was allowed to see. And in my humble opinion, that can't have been anything good and legal. In fact, screw legal. I've had neighbors growing pot back before it was legalized, and all the power to them. It's not hurting anybody. But whatever I just walked into, it sure as hell looked like someone was either getting or was about to get hurt, and really badly too. The cops took a whole 20 minutes to get to me, and that's with the dispatcher telling me that mine was a priority call. They followed me up to my apartment, opened the door for them, and I was right in the middle of telling them about all the plastic sheeting when we saw it was all gone. Both cops gave me a disappointed look as if to say, "We didn't have you down for a schizophrenic." And then right as I'm explaining how it was there not even 20 minutes ago, Florian appears with an explanation. He'd thrown a party, a rather exclusive one, and the two security guards his guests had employed had just been a little overzealous when it came to unexpected guests. According to Florian, there was never any plastic sheeting or black masks, and he wasn't sure what I was talking about in that respect. But what he was sure of was that he and his guests were profusely sorry for the confusion, and that they wished to extend their sympathies for the inconvenience. I was angry. Like inconvenience? I was just assaulted. But then I noticed something else. Florian was showing more emotion and sincerity with the cops than he'd ever shown me. His natural state was dry and sarcastic, but with those two NYPD officers, he was like the most articulate and passionate person ever. And that's when it hit me. He wasn't being sincere. He was acting. The cops wanted to know who the two security guys were and the ones who ended up assaulting me, but Florian claimed that they were provided by an anonymous guest and that he had no idea who they were or where they'd been hired from. The only two people Florian knew, according to him anyways, were his male and female friend, both of whom would be happy to answer any question the cops had. When asked why all the guests had scattered before they arrived, Florian told the two officers that they were incredibly embarrassed at the confusion, He also seemed like he was being totally honest when he said that, with his guests knowing their security would be in trouble with the cops, and they walked out of the apartment building's back door to where their cars were waiting. I could see through Florian's bullcrap, and somehow, by the time the two officers were leaving, they seemed convinced that Florian was as apologetic as he said he was, and that it was all just some big misunderstanding. After the cops left and I asked Florian what had been going on the previous night, he changed his tone completely. He said I had no right to know what had been going on, and that I shouldn't have come back to the apartment when I told him I'd stay away all night. He also added, in a way I found incredibly chilling, that I should consider myself lucky that nothing worse happened to me. And I couldn't believe the sudden switch-up. He put on such a good act for the cops that when he turned, it was like seeing him transform or shapeshift or something like that. He told me he wanted me to move out, and I told him I was planning on it, and then I spent the next few days searching for other places to live before finally finding one that suited my budget. I was lucky, though. I found somewhere decent pretty quick, and to be frank, I was close to living in my car because I did not feel safe around Florian anymore. And to this day, I don't know what he and his friends were doing up there, and actually, I kind of don't want to know either. And that wasn't always the case. I used to spend many an hour trying to figure out what he was really doing because, whatever it was, I didn't think it was anything even remotely innocent. I kept trying to get in touch with the other two cops I dealt with to see if there had been any updates, but it quickly became clear that they weren't remotely interested at all and that they figured that I was some gatecrasher who'd probably got what was coming to him. At least, that was the vibe I got. Because after all, this is New York City, a place where there's a major crime every 4 minutes. But if the walls of that apartment could talk, I bet they'd tell some truly terrifying tales, and these days, I'm happy not hearing a single goddamn one of them. Back in 2009, when I had just turned 22, one of my best friends since childhood met a girl on Facebook. Dean was a bit of a trailblazer in many respects because back then, we thought of him having a Facebook girlfriend as pretty sad, whereas nowadays, meeting on dating apps or sliding into DMs on social media is a totally normal way for couples to find each other. We used to joke about her being a catfish before catfishing was even really a thing. We didn't use that exact term, but there were a lot of jokes about Louise turning out to be a Louis who was 3 times his age. Turns out, Louise was a real person, and when we met her, we understood why Dean was so smitten. They seemed perfectly matched for one another, and within about 18 months of them getting together, Dean announced that he was moving down to Bournemouth so they could be closer. We were gutted to see him go because Bournemouth is a 7-hour drive from where we grew up in Durham, and without a car, it wasn't like he could pop home whenever he liked because the trains took even longer and the fares were outrageous. Since Louise lived with her mom and brother, Dean started looking for flats down in Bournemouth, and then when he got a bit of money saved up and had somewhere to live, off he went. We later found out that he'd moved into a shared apartment just outside of the city center and that he quickly found a job as a kitchen porter, so he didn't burn through too much of his savings. His job was all right, his relationship was flourishing, and the only thing stopping him from getting a flat with his girlfriend was the fact that she didn't have a job yet. On top of that, his new flatmate sounded like a sound fellow, too. The only thing was, Dean wasn't very forthcoming when it came to information about him. As you can imagine, he was very proud of himself for having landed on his feet in the way that he did. He told us all about his new job, all about how nice his new neighborhood was, and he briefly touched on how cool his new flatmate was. They'd have a drink together, have a smoke together, watch horror movies together, but when we asked what he did for a living, or what he looked like, or what he was interested in, Dean was suddenly all vague or one-worded answers. We just put it down to him still being new in the area, and it's not good manners not to pry into people's lives, is it? And regardless, we were pleased that he was doing well, even if it did mean seeing less of him. Anyway, about 6 weeks go by, and Dean ends up inviting us down to Bournemouth for the weekend. We were all about 23 or 24 at the time, meaning that we didn't have a lot of cash to throw around on hotels and all that, but Dean's like, "No, brother, just crash at my place." We drove down on Friday morning, got there in the late afternoon, then went looking for Dean's flat out near a place called Boscombe. We found it no problem. Our mutual friend beeped his horn when we were outside, then we had an ecstatic reunion in the car park of his apartment block. We hadn't seen Dean in nearly 2 months, so we were over the moon to be reunited. But after he invited us inside for a cup of tea and a chinwag, we realized something wasn't quite right about him. He looked pale, he looked like he'd lost weight, and he looked like he wasn't sleeping very well either. And not only that, but the flat that he was living in was an absolute pigsty. We didn't bring it up right away, but we were too busy chatting about this and that and trying not to break into our beer stash too early. But in the end, I asked him if he was feeling up to a few drinks that night because he looked a wee bit peaky. And I'll never forget how he let out a deep sigh before talking, and when he did, he told us that the last 2 weeks had been some of the most difficult of his whole life. Dean's new flatmate had started out as a sound fella, but then after a few weeks, he'd started letting his true colors show. The flat was in such a sorry state because Aaron never, ever cleaned up, and the only way Dean had been roped into living there was that the landlord had scrubbed the place down and made sure Aaron was out of the flat during the viewing. I wouldn't go so far as to say that Aaron and his landlord conspired to trick Dean into signing a 6-month contract because, from what I gathered, they loathed each other with a passion. But they both had something to gain from Dean living there, so I suppose there was some degree of collaboration. You see, Dean hadn't moved into a cozy apartment with an eccentric but playful older roommate. He was living with a mentally unstable alcoholic who never paid his rent and was prone to violent, psychotic outbursts. He just hadn't realized it until it was far too late. Dean said that when he first moved in, he met an Aaron that liked the same kind of music, liked the same kind of films, and who made him feel as welcome as possible by handing him a can of beer every 5 minutes. But then Dean started to realize that Aaron drank pretty much all day, every day, and that by work, Aaron meant that he went out stealing. He didn't tell Dean what he did to make money at first, but once he seemed on the level, he told him that he shoplifted, burgled, went out stealing money from blackout drunks on a Saturday night, just about anything but make an honest living. He also refused to pay any rent, refused to vacate the apartment, and once told Dean that the police would have to come in and drag him out of there, and that's only if one of them fancied losing an eye. The only reason Aaron gave Dean an easy ride, which he didn't seem to give anyone else, was the fact that he was apparently his new drinking buddy and smoking buddy, and if Aaron had anything to do with it, they'd be sharing other things before long. According to Dean, Aaron didn't just drink and have a bit of puff. He did all sorts. Whatever he could get his hands on, and the harder the stuff, the more volatile he became. Dean said that just a few nights before, he'd come home to find Aaron smoking spice, this sort of synthetic cannabis stuff. He said he was out of his mind on it, and then after playing his stereo way too loud for hours in his bedroom, Dean said Aaron came out of his bedroom with an effing samurai sword and started doing moves with it. I don't know what you'd call it. I'm sure the Japanese have a word for it, but Aaron was waving the sword around like he was practicing a fight, but in slow motion. Dean said he retreated to his bedroom immediately and locked the door, then just hoped that Aaron would decide to leave him alone for the night. Aaron never turned his music down when he partied like that, and his neighbors had long given up on making him try. Dean said he learned to live with the incessant droning of industrial metal late at night, but had never gotten used to the sound of Aaron throwing fits. He'd start randomly screaming, or he'd kick or throw something against his bedroom wall, and Dean told us the random and violent nature of the sound would always wake him up. Aaron ate disgusting, smelly food. His hygiene was atrocious, and on more than one occasion, Aaron had tried to climb into bed with Dean in the middle of the night. He'd obviously needed to start locking his door, but he couldn't spend his entire life in his bedroom. What Dean really needed was help getting the hell out of there at a time when Aaron couldn't notice he was leaving. Apparently, Dean had already raised the prospect of moving out after he and Aaron had a minor disagreement over something, and Aaron exploded. He asked what his problem was, if he didn't like him, and if he didn't like him, he should just come out and say it so they could settle their problems like men and not little girls. Aaron's words, not mine or Dean's. Dean had managed to talk his way out of that one, but he realized that if he was going to make an escape, it had to be a quick one, and without Aaron being aware. And that, ladies and gentlemen, was the real reason he'd invited us down for the weekend. Not for a little reunion with the boys. Dean was planning a not-so-great escape. Now, he'd told us all of this, and we still hadn't met Aaron yet. But by that stage, and to be perfectly honest with you, I was a bit nervous about the prospect. I mean, once we'd heard about the whole samurai sword thing, a replica, but still sharp, and how he was so quick to go and grab it, that definitely added a scary dimension to the whole thing. It wasn't a case of just helping Dean move some boxes. We had to plan the whole thing like some type of military operation. And what's worse, we had to wait 48 hours until Sunday to do it, as Aaron would most likely be in the apartment until Sunday afternoon, at which point he'd go out stealing and try to earn a bit of drug money. Then suddenly, right as we agree that Sunday is the day that we help Dean move, we hear keys sliding in the flat's lock, signaling that Aaron had returned home. The door slams, he walks down the little hallway towards the living room where we're sitting, and the whole time, I watched Dean just sort of shrink. I'd never seen him act like that before, ever. His bark was definitely a lot worse than his bite, but Dean wasn't some pushover, so to see him subtly but definitely cowering at this Aaron fellow as he was approaching, it was quite something. Aaron walks into the room, and Dean and I's mutual friend lay eyes on him for the first time. He wasn't quite what I expected, in that he looked more like a metalhead than the kind of shoplifting pawn life we were used to up in Durham. He was covered in tattoos, had shoulder-length, dyed black hair, and had one of those bull-ring nose piercings which he removed to look less conspicuous while on the rob. We were obviously a bit wary of him, but at first, Aaron seemed really friendly and welcoming. Apparently he had no idea Dean had invited us, but he also didn't seem to have a problem with it either. In fact, not only did he seem keen to have us stay for the weekend, he thought it was a good excuse to throw a party. Dean played along, as did we, as Aaron talked about inviting some girls over, getting a few bags and bottles, and all meeting back at the flat in a few hours once it had gotten dark. Dean then says that he wants to walk us around the area a bit, show us the pub that he liked to drink in, then we popped out after saying our goodbyes to Aaron. Now, as you can imagine, first thing we bring up when we're out of the flat was something like, "What the hell are you doing agreeing to a party tonight? This fellow goes mental when he adds a few lines and you're putting us in harm's way. Blah, 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 blah." Aaron then replies that no, it's perfect, because if Aaron blew all the cash that he had on that Friday night, he'd then be forced to go on a shoplifting spree the next day, because he always started craving crack when he's hungover. And our jaws were just on the floor. We're at an age where the cure for a hangover was like a McDonald's breakfast, and in his desperation to be closer to his Facebook girlfriend, Dean had managed to become the flatmate of an actual crackhead. We understood that if we had a blowout that night, we'd be able to move Dean out of that flat and into his girlfriend's mom's garage, which could serve as temporary accommodation, but there was a lot we couldn't reconcile. We each had at least 24 questions for him. I mean, that walk to the pub turned into a proper little interrogation. But all of the questions we asked, like, why didn't you leave earlier, or why don't you just get the police involved, all of his answers came down to one of two things. Number one, Dean was legitimately scared for his safety, and if everything he'd told us was true, especially the stuff about the samurai sword, then he had a right to be. And number two, he needed his friends. He was in a brand new place, knew next to no one, and he was tired, depressed, and afraid. Dean said what little time he got to spend with his girlfriend, he was so exhausted that all he did was catch up on sleep. He needed our help, and he needed it badly, and by God, after all was said and done, we were ready and willing to give it to him. A few hours later, we've got a few beers in the fridge, and Aaron returns from picking up his sniff with his girlfriend in tow. She had a similar looking lifestyle to Aaron, but unlike her boyfriend, she seemed a bit soft and dopey. No offense to the girl, but she seemed a bit slow, like she'd only ended up being Aaron's girlfriend to begin with because he found her easy to manipulate. And that might sound a bit harsh, but that's honestly the reading I got after meeting her, and it's also my way of saying that while Aaron was a maniac, his girlfriend was just a bit daft. Now anyway, we're all sitting around and drinking, and while Aaron thinks we're having a party, me and Dean's mutual friend were basically there as bodyguards. Aaron was nice and friendly at first, but as he worked his way through beer after beer and started doing some harder drugs with his girlfriend, he started to get more and more aggressive. It started when he was doing lines. He offered Dean and me's mutual friend some, and when he declined, he started berating us about how we were no fun. He told us, "Even Dean has a bit of Charlie with us, don't you?" And us, as his old friends, were thinking, "No, he doesn't. Dean likes a beer, but he's hardly ever touched any drugs at all." But then, right there, before our very eyes, Dean leans over and does a bump before giving us both a very sheepish look. I suppose he'd learned to take the path of least resistance, as they say, but seeing how intimidated and browbeaten our old mate was, it was shocking. After all, we hadn't seen Aaron's wild side yet, so it didn't make sense why he was so scared of him. The night went on for a little while longer without incident. Aaron started acting like a total prick, saying the most obnoxious crap you can imagine about just about everything you can imagine. But there were no indications that any swords were about to be produced, so me and Dean and our mutual friend all stayed quite chilled out, and more beers were getting drunk while Aaron's working through his bag of sniff, and then eventually he announced that it was time to put some music on. I suspected he was about to put on something very loud and fast, and I wasn't wrong, but he turned the volume up so loud that we had to literally shout to make ourselves heard. This didn't seem to bother Aaron, though, and he actually thought it was funny that the music was ruining what little vibe we'd got going, and set about trying to make us sing the lyrics to songs we'd never heard before in our lives. Shortly after, Aaron was up dancing, if you could even really call it that, while we just tried our best to get through it in the assurance that it meant getting out of there a day earlier than planned. We kept the drinking to a minimum, knowing we'd be moving boxes or whatever come the following day, but being forced to listen to Aaron's shite music made me want to get blackout drunk. He was content to dance on his own for a while, but after a few songs, he asked his girlfriend to dance with him. And she joined in, but very awkwardly, like she was scared of what he might do, and it wasn't long before Aaron showed exactly why she seemed so anxious. They were dancing at first, but then Aaron started getting rougher and rougher with her, until some of his dance moves consisted of him just choking her from behind. I don't mean like putting his hand around her neck either, like you could see on his girlfriend's face that she couldn't breathe. He did it a couple more times, and we're getting ready to step in because he's choking her for longer and longer each time, but then his girlfriend suddenly elbows him, shoves him off, and slaps him. And then, all hell breaks loose. We later found out Dean had been a witness to a lot of this sort of behavior, and had always tried to intervene where possible, but he could only do so much knowing that he had to live with the bloke, and by that, I mean he couldn't just deck him like he'd wanted to. But then, since me and his other mate were there, and knowing we had his back, Dean launches himself across the room as Aaron starts throwing punches at his girlfriend's face. We followed in his footsteps, and within a few seconds, we had Aaron restrained. Dean starts shouting at his girlfriend to leave, but she didn't move. She just stood there, frozen, like she didn't know what to do. I joined in shouting at her to call the police, but instead of snapping out of it and calling 999, she ran off into Aaron's room and slammed the door shut, leaving the three of us basically sitting on top of him. We do a bit of shuffling about, then I'm able to get off of him, grab my phone, and call the police. I told them that we had a mental case in our hands. A bloke had gone berserk and he was going to hurt someone because we couldn't restrain him all night. The lady on the phone said that she could hear Aaron screaming about how he was going to kill us and that she'd get someone out to us as soon as possible, which she did. Aaron was still screaming bloody murder when the police got there, and after he tried attacking them as well, that was it. He was off to the cells for the night, giving us a tidy 24 hours to move Dean's stuff out into his girlfriend's mom's place. It'd be cramped, but Aaron had no idea where the house was, so there'd be no tracking him down, and sharing a bathroom with 3 normal people was better than sharing one with a dangerous and violent psychopath. We got Dean out of there, so it was mission accomplished, and then we went out to celebrate on the Sunday before we drove back to Durham. But now I look back on it, the celebration feels a bit bittersweet. Aaron made things easy for us by trying to bite a policeman, and so it was a quick in and out, and Dean was able to end a miserable little chapter in his life. But I sometimes think about Aaron's girlfriend, how even after choking and punching her, she'd run into Aaron's bedroom at the first sign of trouble and just stayed there. We shouted at her to leave, to call the police, but she chose to run into the bedroom of her abusive boyfriend and lock the door. And sometimes I really worry for that girl's future. But with the attitude she's got, I suppose there's only so much you can do. And that being said, I hope someone gets her some help, some proper help, before it's too late. I was a real idiot when I was younger. I got hooked on Oxycontin, got in trouble with the cops, then ended up faced with 2 choices. Either go to jail or take part in a state-mandated rehab program called The Farm. The Farm was, unsurprisingly, a farm, and I'm guessing its owner had friends in high places because he managed to wrangle himself a deal whereby he could get himself all the dirt-cheap labor he needed so long as they were all troubled youths facing jail time. I guess that sounds real exploitative or whatever, but looking back on it, I'm not sure it was the farmer who benefited more. I guess I can't speak for the other kids, but working in that place sure as hell saved my ass. And sometimes I think it just might have been a stroke of genius sending us to that place, because picking up trash on the side of the highway is one thing, but seeing how putting time and love into something really can create something beautiful, it fixed a part of my brain I didn't know needed fixing. I made friends at the farm that I still talk to. Granted, it's on Facebook because we live at opposite ends of the country now, but the point still stands. It gave me discipline and self-belief, which is amazing considering I showed up expecting it to be nothing but baby jail. But then, I guess it's the irony of ironies that all of the crazy stuff I did on the street, it all kind of pales in comparison to something I went through at the farm. So when you first got to the farm, you were assigned a job and a roommate. Your job could be anything from livestock and crop management to irrigation or pest control, but your roommate was there for one purpose alone, to help break you into the routine and make sure you stayed on track. These roommates were ideal for the role because the system was working for them and they could talk from the heart about how it could work for the newbies too. And that's how it worked with my mentor anyway, and when it came time, I gladly accepted the role myself. I knew it'd be a challenge, and I'm sure I myself was a challenge when I first arrived, but I also knew that I had to give something back before I left the program and moved on with my life. Not everyone made it to mentorship level, and as cheesy as it might sound, I considered it an honor and a privilege. For the first time in my life, I felt truly appreciated and wanted to share my own appreciation in return. So around 9 months into the program, I'd risen to the position of livestock supervisor, and had been given my own 2-bedroom living quarters in preparation for receiving my mentee. Obviously, the dorms were very strictly divided by gender, so I knew my mentee was going to be female. But what I didn't know, and had no way of knowing until I met her, was how cooperative she was going to be. If she was chilled out, repentant, and receptive, then the next month would be an absolute breeze for me. But then if she wasn't, I knew things could get very rough. I'd already heard a bunch of horror stories and how troublesome uncooperative mentees could be when the rubber really hit the road, and in 1 or 2 classes, fights had broken out between the mentors and their roommates. I really didn't want that to happen, so my whole game plan focused on pacification and building a rapport between myself and my mentee. Pretty much the exact same tactic my own mentor took back when I first arrived at the farm. So, the day my mentee was due to arrive, I was actually really excited to meet her, and I wasn't in the least bit discouraged by her attitude upon arrival. Now, she obviously didn't want to be there, but very few did upon first touching down, so I understood her reticence and took it in my stride. Since I was still in livestock, she accompanied me on a few days' work with the animals after her induction was finished. And although she really didn't take to it at first, she warmed up with time and showed rapid improvement. She was due to be with me for a month, and the month could have either been very short or very long, and by about week 2, it was looking like it was going to be the short kind. Shauna, my mentee, was fitting and well, and although her attitude needed major work sometimes, we were making some major breakthroughs together. And then came the day that the cops arrived, 2 of them, and I spotted them talking to a very concerned-looking group leader. I walked over, mainly intent on listening in on what they were saying, but when the group leader spotted me, she called me over to talk. I found out the cops had driven all the way out from the city because they were looking for someone, and that someone just so happened to be my mentee, Shauna. They didn't just want to talk to her either. She had a warrant out for her in another county. They were there to arrest her. Obviously, this kind of presented us with a very precarious situation because we didn't know how Shauna was going to react to all this. She could potentially be going back to jail for whatever she'd done, so if she saw the cops coming, she might just try and run. I mean, it wouldn't be the first time, and she's been so volatile at the beginning that no one could be 100% sure about what she'd do. But then, as we were thinking about it, I had an idea. If I could go and talk to her first and break the bad news, it might be received better coming from me instead of cops. I remember how, when I was on Oxys, just the sight of a cop would give me major anxiety. And I don't know, maybe in another life I'd have made a run for it too. And all that progress, all that hope so suddenly and cruelly being taken away. It was a nightmare, but one that was about to be Shauna's reality in the next couple of minutes, unless I was there to soften the blow. Once the plan was agreed upon, I walked off towards the dorms to where I was pretty sure Shauna was just kind of chilling in her room. She was right where I expected her to be when I walked in, and I sat down in the bed opposite her and told her how we needed to talk. I think she genuinely had no idea that that other warrant was out for her because when I dropped the news, she was devastated. To say it was emotional would be the understatement of the century, and she actually did bring up the idea of just running off before the cops could see where she went. But then somehow, I managed to talk her into just going with the cops to see what the warrant was about, because it was better to face the music than run from it and make things worse. The thing that really seemed to convince her was when I asked her if she was 100% truly certain that she didn't know what the warrant was about. Then when she gave me yet another convincing no, I told her that it couldn't have been that serious. She'd remembered robbing a liquor store or shooting someone, but if she seriously didn't remember and wasn't blackout drunk when it happened, then it couldn't have been any worse than a missed court date or a traffic violation. Shauna calmed down a little like, damn, you're right. And after promising that the group leaders would put in a good word for her so that she might be able to come back, she agreed to follow me over to where the cops were waiting. I remember how we were walking side by side after we left the dorms, but when we turned the corner of the community hub and the cops came into view, Shauna slipped from my side and started to drop back just a little. It was obviously just a little hesitancy on her part, but I figured we were over that and kept encouraging her. But when I looked back in her direction after she totally slipped from me, I didn't notice that she was reaching for something. But she must have been, because I looked back towards the cops and the next thing I know, there's a knife at my throat. I just froze for a few seconds, and feeling the knife to my throat was one thing, but realizing it was Shauna that was holding it was another thing entirely. I was completely blindsided, and all I could do was just stand there as Shauna held my head with one hand and the knife with the other, as cops drew their weapons and started to approach. Shauna started telling me to walk backwards, which I did, but I think the movement kind of kicked my brain into life because the words, "What are you doing?" just started tumbling out of my mouth. I said stuff like, "Shauna, what are you doing? Shauna, think about what you're doing." And she responds, "I know what I'm doing. I'm not going to jail. I'm getting out of here." All the while, the cops are screaming to put the knife down, but all Shauna seemed focused on was walking backwards and not cutting my throat on accident. I remember telling her, "They're going to shoot you, Shauna. They're going to kill you if you don't stop." And she just yelled at me to shut up and keep walking, which again is what I did. Kids had come running to see what was going on because they could hear all the yelling. So as we're walking backwards, almost hip to hip, there's this big gathering of kids all watching from near the community hub. And it was chaos. But I never once believed Shauna would ever do me any harm. It was just a desperate attempt to avoid going to jail, and as soon as she got to the trees over near the livestock fields, she was going to make a run for it. But that's not what happened. There was about a minute where I was trying to convince her to let me go, but Shauna was too busy trying to get the cops to keep their distance. She was yelling at them to stay back and all this other stuff and totally ignoring anything that I had to say to her. But then there was this moment when she stopped, and it was like she came back to me for a second. At first, she told me to shut up again, but I kept telling her how what she was doing wouldn't work. If the cops didn't catch her on foot, she'd end up running from them on her own in a place where she was unfamiliar with. If she stuck to the roads, she'd be in cuffs within hours, but if she stuck to the woods, it'd be her versus the bears and cougars and Mother Nature. And I told her again, "This won't work, Shauna." And in reply, she told me, "Yes, it will, because they'll be too busy trying to save you than to chase me." I could write all night, I guess, and still not even get close to how terrified those words made me feel. And like I said, I was 99.999% convinced that Shauna meant me zero harm and had just panicked when she realized she was going to jail. But maybe she even remembered what the warrant was about and remembered that it was way worse than she first thought. Who knows? Not like she's around to ask her either. And the last thing she yelled as she intended to draw the blade of that knife across my throat was, "I'm sorry." But she didn't just say it, she yelled it. And I guess that was all the cops needed to hear. She yelled that apology, and I felt the blood hit my face. But it wasn't mine. It was Shauna. After one of the cops heard her cry, took aim and pulled the trigger. I had a tiny cut where the knife nicked me as she fell, but other than that, I was completely unharmed. Shauna, on the other hand, was probably dead before she even hit the dirt. The cop put the bullet right through her brainstem, and there was a hole in her face between her nose and her eye. I just started screaming. Like I didn't know if I had been shot, how bad the cut to my throat was, because, like I said, it was bleeding a little and I was in a state of complete hysteria. I got down on my knees and started trying to wake Shauna up, like shaking her. I thought that there'd be a chance that she'd survive the shot. I mean, people survive crazy head wounds sometimes. But I think I just knew, maybe from the look in her eyes, that there was no more life inside her anymore. That day was the worst of my entire life. It's not something I'll ever get over either. I've just learned to live with it. I know Shauna had to die so that I might live, and I heard the sureness in her voice, and I know in my heart that she might have been about to kill me. But that doesn't mean that every single day I don't think about her and wish that she'd made a different choice. Hey friends, thanks for listening. Click that notification bell to be alerted of all future narrations. I release new videos every Monday and Thursday at 7 p.m. EST, and there are super fun live streams every Sunday and Wednesday nights. If you got a story, be sure to submit them over email, and you might even hear your story featured on the next video. That email is letsreadsubmissions@gmail.com. And if you want to support me even more, grab early access to all future narrations and bonus content over on Patreon, or click that big join button to hear about the extra perks for members of the channel. And check out the Let's Read podcast, where you can hear all of these stories in big compilations and save huge on data, located anywhere you listen to podcasts. All links in the description below. Thanks so much, friends. And remember, Harambe.